guys? Part is the promise for the land of Israel, right? Oops. The second part is the promise of the land of Israel. He wants reassurance, or how am I going to know that we're going to get the land of Israel? And here, as we get to the most, second part of the covenant between the parts, where there's actually a lot going on. We read the verses inside. We'll read it again, hopefully this week. So we'll read it slowly. But where there's this whole ceremony, and they cut the animals in half, and God communicates with him. And most importantly, God tells him that his descendants will be in Egypt for 400 years, and then they're going to emerge with great wealth. And that's in response to the second question: how am I going to know? How am I going to know that I'm going to get the land of Israel? And there are so many questions about this story, about this chapter, and so many interpretations. And like we said last week, when there are a lot of interpretations, what does that tell you? It tells you that there's no good one, because if there was one great one, you wouldn't need 20 answers. And everybody's trying to explain a different angle. Not everybody is satisfied. Not everybody's happy. I read the Kli Yakar this morning. I said, what does the Kli Yakar say? Kli Yakar says, well, there's so many interpretations here. Go look at that Barbanel. He collected them. I'm not going to sit and repeat it. So we'll do a little bit of that. We'll read a little Kli Yakar, a little Barbanel, a little other theories. We'll give some of the interpretations, and then we'll see what we can make of this. Let's think about which verses we want to read before we begin the analysis of the commentators. So the first thing we'll do is we'll share the screen for those who are not here, don't necessarily have the book. Share the screen to Genesis 15. Oops.
Rabbi, didn't it show when Abraham asked God to give him a sign that he didn't have enough faith just to take God's word for it?
Yeah, so that's a possible interpretation, that Abraham's request is a lack of faith. That's a possible interpretation. And the possible interpretation is that another possible interpretation based on that original possible interpretation is that that lack of faith generates the reason for the exile. In other words, why can't we inherit the land right away? Why do we need to stop in exile for 400 years? That is a response to Abraham's lack of faith. That is certainly one interpretation. Okay, so let's read. I think we read the first couple of verses last week. I think we'll start from Genesis 15:6. Okay, we'll go back to 4. Why not? Genesis 15:4. So, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him saying, this one will not inherit you. In other words, it's not going to be Eliezer, who is your servant, but the one who will spring forth from your innards, he will inherit you. That's verse 4. Then you get to verse 5. In the art scroll, it's page 67. Then you go to verse 5. And verse 5 is, and he took him outside and he said, please look heavenward and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so will be your seed. Your seed will be like the stars. It's very interesting because yesterday's parsha, we read that God tells Jacob that his children will be like the dust of the earth. And here you have like the stars, but that's for another time. Then you have a very interesting verse 6. V'amin b'Hashem, and he believed in the Lord. Abraham believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. That second verse has that second clause, and he counted it to him as righteousness, has two interpretations. We'll begin with the simple interpretation, and then we'll give the interesting one. The simple interpretation is, and he counted to him as righteousness. God counts it as a merit for Abraham. The fact that Abraham has faith is a merit for Abraham, right? So this is verse 6 is a very powerful verse. Hamin b'Hashem, God, and Abraham believes in God. Wonderful. Problem with this verse, not the problem. This, Jill, is sort of undermines Jill's interpretation. Jill's interpretation is that in the next verse is going to be a lack of faith. Oh, that's very difficult. Verse 6 is declaring Abraham's faith in God. And then 2 verses later, it seems like Abraham lacks faith. So that that is a reason to believe that what's going to happen in verse 8 is not a lack of faith in God. Because how could it be that 2 verses after God says that Abraham believed in God, all of a sudden he has a lack of faith? It's just too soon. So that's just a reason to say that it's not, but we'll get there in a minute. God continues, and Hashem said to him, verse 7, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you forth from Ur of the Chaldees. Ur Kasdim, that's the city where Abraham came from. So God says, I took you out of there to give you this land to inherit it. Okay, so far everything is fine. We have a promise for children in verse 5. Verse 6 is Abraham believes in that promise. Hamin ba'Hashem, you know 2 ways of interpreting this. He believed in God, right there. Verse 7, God says, oh, by the way, remember I took you out of the Ur Kasdim? I took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land. In other words, I'm giving you the land of Israel to inherit it. And here we have verse 8. And he said, Abraham says, oh Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it? This is a strange verse. What is the question? Bameh Edah. How will I know that I will inherit it? If you want to translate it precisely, literally, Bama, with what will I know that I will inherit it? In English, you translate how. But what is how? How is with what? Show me a sign. Tell me something that through this I'll know that I'll inherit it. Which is a very problematic verse, because verse 8, as Jill pointed out, implies a lack of faith. How will I know? What do you mean, how will you know? Didn't God just tell you one verse earlier? God said, I took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land. And immediately after, he says, God, how do I know I'm going to get it? What do you mean, how do I know? God just told you you're going to get it.
But that's not, other people are involved also, because when it comes to having your own children, it's up to you basically. But when it comes to the land, there may be other inhabitants or stuff like that.
There aren't other inhabitants in the land, but did God know? Did God know that there are other inhabitants? I hope so. So God knows all the facts. God has all the facts in front of him, and he says, I'm the Lord. I took you out of Ur Kasdim. I'm giving you this land. God says, everyone says, how do I know? Now, if you say this is a guy who continuously questions God, right? Okay, fine. But that's not what we see. We just said a verse before, it says, Hamin ba'Hashem, he believes in God. Now, there are people who say that this is a lack of faith. And in fact, they say that it's a lack of faith. And the response, the subsequent promise for the exile is because of the lack of faith. Some people say that. But that's not the only way to read the verses.
Maybe he's just looking for the ways to acquire the land, like asking for advice in a way.
Okay, so that's another interpretation. That's a good interpretation. Bameh Edah, how will I know? So Jill, so Vicky says,
Rabbi, yeah,
there's
another thing, because I remember when Moses asked God, tell me what the signs are so I can tell the people, so they'll know what to, so I can, guarantee that they don't stop following me for naught.
right.
But that's not how he says it. He doesn't say, what should I tell the people? He just,
right, and there's no people right now. Maybe there's not people in the future. But Bameh Edah, how will I know?
Okay. Yes.
Now, you're right that Jill is right and Vicky's right. Everyone's right that there are some people that read it this way. And I'm going to tell you exactly how they read it. Bameh Edah, how will I know? With what will I know that I will inherit it? And this comes from the Talmud. Talmud says, what does it mean with what shall I know? With what will I know? Well, the Talmud says, with what merit? How will I know that you're promising it to me? So children, you're giving it to me. But how do I know that my children are going to merit the receiving of the land of Israel? So now it's another question. It's not a question of lack of faith. It's a question of what are we going to do? What am I going to tell my children to do? How do I know that my children are going to deserve it? That's a Talmud's interpretation. What's the response? What does God say? So let's continue. Let's continue, and then we'll read the various interpretations of this. So many interpretations. The Medrash is full of interpretations. I'm going to do one or two, but let's see the big idea. I'm going to read verse 9, verse 10, and verse 11. So his question is, how do I know that I'm going to inherit it? So right now we're going to say the first possibility is it's a lack of faith. Nachmanides says that. He says it's a lack of faith. We're going to put that aside for a second. We're going to go to the interpretation that verse 8 is not a lack of faith. Rather, verse 8 is Bameh Eda. How will I know? How do I know that my children are going to merit the land of Israel? Right? It could be hundreds of years later. How do I know they're going to merit it? And even more, some people say, how do I know that they're going to be preserved in the land of Israel? Irashena, inheritance means that it's yours for good, right? Inherits, it's for you and it's for your descendants as well. So what Abraham is saying, maybe my children will not be deserving. Remember, Abraham is coming post-flood, right? He knows that sometimes people become wicked and they're punished, and maybe they could lose their inheritance. So Abraham wants to know, what do I do to ensure, how do I know that my children, how can I have confidence that my children will be worthy of the land of Israel? So let's see the response. Verse 9. Go ahead.
But I'm still having a problem with the grammar.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to? That doesn't sound like how.
No, how is not the literal translation. Literal translation is Bameh with what? So
What?
if you want to say how, it's not, if you want to say it's a lack of faith, you say, give me a sign. And the response is the sign, because now you have the covenant between the parts, there's cutting animals, there's birds coming down, things are happening. That's the sign, right? But if you need a sign, if you're asking for a sign, means that there's lack of faith. So that's one way of reading it. If you read it not with what, as in give me a sign that I know it's going to happen, but you read it as with what merit will they have, then it fits in the word bameh with what? With what will I know that they will inherit it, that I will inherit it, but inherit it implies future generations. So the question then becomes, what is the reason and what's the assurance that my children are going to inherit the land of Israel for all generations? Now we know the history. We know for most of our history, we were not in the land of Israel, right? So we were not in the land of Israel for all of our history. So Abraham has a right question. And the right question is, how do I know you're going to give it to us? How do I know that we're going to preserve our relationship with the land of Israel, will preserve and survive all of history, even if my children sin? So that's the question. So now we sort of, quote unquote, we have two interpretations. Both are legitimate. Like I said, Nachmanides says it's a lack of faith and it's a problem. And we'll get to Nachmanides in a minute. But now we're going to take the other interpretation, which is a Talmudic interpretation, which says it's not a lack of faith, because the question with what is not with what. How do I know? How do I know? Prove it to me. The question is, what am I going to do that will ensure that I'm going to get the land of Israel? So now we go back to the verses, and here's the response. So we're going to read verse 9, verse 10, and verse 11. And he said to him, take for me 3 heifers and 3 goats and 3 rams and turtle dove and a young bird. It's opening up a petting zoo. Okay. And he took for him all these. So Abraham takes all of this. And he divided them in the middle. It could be divided the animals, but it could even be he cut the animals, depending on how you want to read it. And he placed each part opposite its mate, but he did not divide the birds. And the birds of prey descended upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. Okay, I'm going to drop verse 11 for a minute. There's a few ways of reading it. Let's leave 11 alone. Let's do 9 and 10. So Abraham says, Abraham says, how do I know that I will inherit it? That's verse 8. And the answer is verse 9. Take from me 3 heifers and 3 goats and 3 rams and turtle doves and a young bird. And he took for him all these and he divided them in the middle. So first I'll give you the simple interpretation, then I give you the Talmudic interpretation. Simple interpretation is that God is telling him it's called a brit, it's called a covenant. What is a brit? What's a covenant? A covenant is that it's a commitment. I'm making a commitment. In other words, it's not because you're going to deserve it, your descendants will going to deserve it. It's a covenant, and the covenant doesn't always have a reason. What is a covenant and why do people make covenants? So some interpretation of a covenant is like a treaty. I do this for you, you do that for me, and it's a treaty. But that's not the only way of reading covenants. The other way of reading a covenant is 2 people have a relationship. 2 people are friends, and everything is fine. Why? What do you need? What do you need a covenant for? We're good friends. But especially in the ancient world, people made covenants. What does the covenant mean? The covenant means right now I'm your friend, right now we're on good terms. What's going to happen if in the future one of us does something wrong? And the love won't be there anymore. And the friendship won't be there anymore. So that's why you make the covenant. You make the covenant, it's a commitment. Because I love you right now, make a commitment that even if there'll be no reason for the love, I will still love you. Right? Think about a covenant of marriage, for example. If you're in love with the other person, why get married? And what's marriage? In some sense, marriage is all different elements, but in some sense, marriage is a covenant. Because what marriage is telling you, maybe one day I'll wake up in the morning and I'm not going to feel the love with the full intensity that I feel it right now. So I have two responses. Either I can check out of town, I can leave, or I could say, no, I'm committing. And because I'm committing, that commitment will survive that downturn in the love, and then the love will reemerge. But my point is that the idea of a covenant is I'm connecting to you and we're one. And even if in the future there'll be no reason for the love, I still commit to love. That's a brit. That's one form of a covenant in the ancient world. And the commentaries say that's exactly what God is doing. How did they do covenants in the ancient world? It's a little gory. They take an animal, they slice it in half, and they walk between the animal. What does that represent? That represents we're one. We're both part. We're in the middle, and we walk between. You'll see later. He walks between. With the fire and Abraham walk between the two parts. That's why they call it the covenant between the parts. We'll see in a minute. But the point here is, if we both are walking between two halves of something, that means we're as one collective. And just like you don't add, and just like you love yourself always, in other words, you're always committed to self. So you commit to always treat the other person as self. And that's the covenant. In other words, one way of reading the covenant between the parts is Abraham comes and asks, how do I know that I'm going to inherit the land? How do I know my children are going to be worthy? And what's the answer? The answer is, it doesn't matter if your children are worthy. The commitment to God to give the Jewish people the land of Israel is a covenant. And a covenant, at least in this interpretation, a covenant does not require the other person to be worthy. In fact, the whole purpose of a covenant is to commit that even when the person is not worthy, I still will have that relationship. Because if the person is always worthy, you don't need a covenant. Now, it's very different than the way other people read covenants, but that's at least one interpretation of the covenant. Now, that's the conventional way of reading this. Maimonides, the Talmud would say something else. So bear with me. And again, I'm putting out a lot of interpretations. Hopefully, before we leave, we make a map and we organize everything. Go ahead, Jill, please.
Okay, I want to go back to 9, and they said, "Take me 3 heifers and 3 goats." If we were to work backwards and say that is the answer to what question, the question becomes, how shall you sacrifice to me? How shall you show me that you got my message? Or, but it doesn't answer the question, how will I know I will inherit it? It's as if the question was left out. There was a question in between.
Okay, so you said something. You said something very powerful, and I'm just going to help you say clarify what you said and why it's so interesting. Because that's exactly what the Talmud says. And that's the answer. And based on the answer, we'll know what the question is. Says the Talmud, look at verse 9 and look at the categories of animals: heifers, goats, rams, turtle dove, and a young bird. Okay? Open up the book of Leviticus, where you read about the offerings, and you will see that only these are the species from which offerings are brought. So what do you see from this verse? What's verse 9? Says the Talmud. Verse 9 is korbanot, offerings. So Abraham comes. Now, based on the answer, we interpret the question, as I said a moment ago. Abraham comes and says, how do I know that my children will be worthy of the... How do I know that my children will be worthy of the land of Israel? What's the answer? The answer is because of the offerings. Now, this interpretation was offered by the sages of the Talmud. Problem is, in the sages of the Talmud, there are no offerings. Right? They already lived after the destruction of the temple. So the Talmud continues. So Abraham tells God, the backstory, it's not written in the verse, but it's all included in the conversation. Abraham tells God, yeah, that's when there's a temple. What do we do when there's no temple? So we know the answer, because the sages believe that the sages instituted the prayers instead of the offerings. And also part of the prayer is we mention and we study the Torah, the laws of the offerings. And what Abraham says, according to the Talmud, is when Abraham says, what are we going to do when there's no offerings? So the answer is, we have the Seder HaKorbanot, we have the order of the offerings. In other words, we could study the offerings in the Torah, and that is the merit, and that's why we get the land of Israel. So that's what the Talmud says. I'm going to add a dimension to that based on other interpretations. We're going to explain this interpretation in a moment. But so far, what we have is two possibilities. Either this is a lack of faith, God show me a sign, and the lack of faith triggers a punishment. That's one possibility. Another possibility is it's not a lack of faith. It's Abraham wants to ensure that his commitment, that Abraham wants to ensure that the land of Israel, his children will receive the land of Israel. And he wants to know, what could we do? What merit will we have that we will get the land of Israel? And here there's two interpretations. Either God says it's a covenant. You don't need a reason. I'm committing to them. Or the Talmud says, because of the offerings. We don't always have the offerings, but we always can study the offerings. Why the offerings? Why is the offering so important? And why is the offerings that which allows us to inherit the land of Israel and to preserve the land of Israel? In other words, preserve our connection to it, so that we have to go a little deeper. Okay, based on this, I want to go back and reread all the verses and explain how this interpretation could be found in all the verses. That it's really a question of, how do I know I'm going to inherit it? In other words, how do I know that my children are going to be deserving of it? Point one. Point number two, that this response is the response of the offerings. So I'm doing from memory. I really should open up the commentator, but I'll try from memory. We'll try from memory. Okay, let's go back to verse 6. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. Right? That was verse 4 and 5. 4 and 5, God told him you're going to have children. And verse 5, God told him you can have children as much as the stars, as many as the stars. And verse 6 says, and he, Abraham, believed in the Lord. Okay. He believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteousness. What does the second half of the verse mean? I told you before, there's two interpretations. Conventional interpretation is, Vayachshevel lo tzedakah, that Abraham believed in God, and God considered it righteousness to Abraham. In other words, Abraham gets it's considered a righteousness, it's considered a merit to Abraham that Abraham believed in God. That is the conventional interpretation. The commentaries say, what's going on over here? Abraham believed in God, that's a merit? Believe in God is a merit. Abraham believed in God Abraham moved to Israel because of the belief in God. Abraham believed in God. Why is that a great merit to believe in God? Tell me Abraham sacrificed his son for God, there's a merit, that I understand. But just the belief in God is a merit, it's hard to understand. And then another problem is verse number 7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you forth from the Ur Kasdim to give you this land to inherit it. And Abraham says, how will I know that I will inherit it? Why does the Torah and why does God drop this piece of information? I am the Lord that took you out of Ur Kasdim. God, we know God told him to leave Ur Kasdim and go to Israel. We know that. Well, really, God didn't tell him to leave from Ur Kasdim. God took him out of Ur Kasdim. We'll explain what that means. God took him out of Ur Kasdim and he came to Israel. We know that it's written earlier, but that piece of information is not reiterated in any of the other commandments up till this point. Something about this parsha is God has to reiterate, I took you out of Ur Kasdim. Why? Okay. So now we're going to reread all the verses and see the deeper conversation. What I'm saying now is based on the interpretation of the Malbim. So here's beautiful. Let's go back to 6. And he believed in the Lord. Abraham believed in the Lord. Okay. And he, Abraham, counted it to him, God, as righteousness. The exact opposite of the way we read it conventionally. Conventionally, we read, Abraham believed in God, and God considered it righteousness that Abraham believed in God, right? That was the conventional interpretation. Here, we're reading it the opposite. God just told Abraham that you're going to have children as many as the stars. Abraham believes in God. But what doesn't he believe in God? He believes in God that God will do it. Why will God do it? Why will God fulfill the promise? There are two possibilities. Either because Abraham is deserving, or because of God's kindness, God's giving charity. It's not because Abraham deserves it. So Abraham hears this great promise. God comes to him and says, we're going to make you a great nation, even though you're an older person, you're in your 80s, and naturally you didn't have any children, and naturally it would be a problem to have children. Abraham believes in God. And he says, I'm going to have children as many as the stars. Amazing, amazing. But now the question is, why does Abraham believe? In other words, based on what merit, why would God do this? Either Abraham could say it's because I earned it, or he could say it's God's charity. So now the verse says, and he, Abraham, accounted it to him as righteousness, that this is God, it's God's righteousness. It's not because I deserve it. That's verse 6. Again, this is just the first layer. We're going to build on this. But go ahead.
But tzedakah means not righteousness, it also means charity.
Charity means I'm not deserving. They translate it as righteousness. It could be charity. Tzedakah, we use tzedakah as charity. In other words, what is verse 6 saying? I asked you, one of the questions of the Malbim is, that's the big praise. Abraham believed in God. Everybody believes in God, and certainly Abraham. Why do you have to say Abraham? And not every time God tells Abraham something, that say Abraham believed in God. So what we're and say believe in God is one thing, and say, wow, this is the great merit. Abraham believes in God. Okay, there are billions of people that believe in God. Abraham was tested, but that's not what we're saying here. So that's why he's reading this verse and saying, no, not that Abraham believed in God and God considered it righteousness that Abraham believed in God. No, Abraham believed in God because Abraham believed that God is doing tzedakah. God is doing charity with him. In other words, I'm not deserving of the promise of having many children. And the reason why God will do it is because God is charitable. That is step number 1, verse 6. And now we'll continue reading the conversation, goes back and forth. It's like a ping pong match. Yeah, so far so good?
Well, the basic question is not what that Abraham believes in God. The basic question is, does God believe in Abraham?
Right. That sounds like Abraham Yeshua Heschel, right? Abraham Joshua Heschel, right? God believes in man. V'hamin b'Hashem. So does God believe in man? It's clear. It seems to me that God believes in Abraham, right? He took him out of Ur Kasdim, etc. But we want to make that relationship reciprocal. In other words, it has to be both ways, right? So that's the discussion here. But again, how do I understand if God showers you, gives you a promise, and this is a great promise that your children are going to be like the stars. So, like I said, there's 2 ways of thinking about this. You could think about this as it would actually make me arrogant. Okay, let's stop for a second. Today's the 10th of Kislev, the day the second Chabad Rebbe was released from prison. Leading up to the 19th of Kislev next week, when Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, was released from prison. When the founder of Chabad was released from prison, he wrote a letter to his followers. And he said, a great miracle has to make you humble. And he said there's 2 responses to miracles. There's 2 responses to God's kindness to you. One response is, God showers me with blessings and it makes me arrogant. What does it say? It says, wow, God did this kindness to me. It means I'm so great. And he says a lot of people respond that way. The more successful they become, the more arrogant they become. Because they say that God's kindness to them is evidence of their merits, that they have great merits, and it actually makes them more arrogant. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that's not the response of a Jew. And he quotes this week's parsha that we start reading today. Jacob says, I've been diminished. I've become small from all the kindnesses that God did for me. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman interprets that when God does kindness for you, you become more humble because you say, I'm not deserving, right? So what am I saying? I'm saying there's 2 ways to respond to a great blessing or a great promise from God. One response is to say, I'm deserving of this. And of course, yeah, God, you actually owe me more. So you're lucky. You're getting off the hook. You're getting off the hook. The low price. I'm deserving of more. But Abraham's response is, I'm not deserving. And why is God doing this to me? Tzedakah is charity. So that's verse 6. But we're not done. We're just beginning the conversation. Again, what I'm saying now is based on the Malbim. So I'm either take it or leave it. But at least there's a source for this. This explains verse 7. Verse 7, God says, no. And he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you forth from the Ur of the Chaldeans, or Kasdim, to give you this land to inherit it. What is God saying? God is saying, no. You are getting this land not because of charity, but because you earned it. Where do you see that in verse 7? Where do you see in verse 7 that Abraham earned the land of Israel? because God says, I am the Lord who took you out of Ur Kasdim. What happened in Ur Kasdim? Well, we know in Medrash, and the Medrash says that in Ur Kasdim, Abraham discovers God, and he risks his life to preach monotheism, and the king tried to kill him. And the Medrash actually said he was thrown into the fire. But other commentaries say it doesn't literally mean he was thrown into the fire. It means that it was decreed against him to be thrown into the fire. That's what Abarbanel says. Abarbanel says it doesn't actually mean he was thrown into the fire and miraculously saved, but he was put in prison and it was decreed that he be thrown into the fire and he was miraculously saved. So when God mentions, I'm the Lord who took you out of Ur Kasdim, what God is saying is we have a history. You're the person who risked your life to preach the oneness of God. The fact that you're going to get this promise is not a tzedakah. It's not God giving charity. It's not God isn't a charitable move, so he's giving everybody promises, right? God didn't promise somebody else that his descendants will be like the stars. So God is saying, no, you don't understand. God is saying, you earned this because you were in Ur Kasdim. I took you out of Ur Kasdim. Ur Kasdim is the fire of Kasdim. The fire, we know what the fire means. The fire means either the actual or the decree, the death penalty that Abraham faces to preach the oneness of God. So verse 6, God is saying, Abraham is saying, wow, God, you're so charitable. I believe that you're going to give me these descendants because you're charitable. Verse 7, God says, no. God says, I took you out of Ur Kasdim. You earned it. I earned it? You have to earn the promise? Here comes verse 8. God says, Abraham says, how do I know I'm going to inherit? How do I know that I'm going to give me a sign? What am I going to do to inherit the land? What am I going to do to ensure that my children will also be deserving? If it's a gift, it's a gift is a gift. It doesn't say it's a gift. It says Yerusha, which is an inheritance. But you're saying, if God is saying, I'm getting it because I was taken out of Ur Kasdim. In other words, we had a merit. So he says, what happens if we lose the merit? Right? We're not always going to be deserving. So if you can get the merit, you can lose the merit. So now comes verse 8, and verse says, he says to him, O Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it? What am I going to do to make sure that we are always deserving? And now you understand the conversation. And now you understand why Abraham all of a sudden decides that he needs to have a proof. He needs to have a reason of why he's deserving. Because according to this interpretation, that's exactly what God is saying in verse 7. In verse 7, God says, the fact that you're getting the land, the fact that you're getting all these promises is not a charity. You're not a charity case. The fact that you're getting it is because you earned it. Abraham says, I earned it. How do I know that I'm going to be able to preserve the merit? How do I know that my future generations are also going to be deserving and it's not just going to get cut off and the merit won't get cut off and the land won't be given to somebody else? And that's verse 8. Now we have to get to, so what's the response to that? The offerings, what does that mean? And what does it mean that there's going to be the going into Egypt? We have to get into that. But you see how the conversation is developing. Abraham begins by thinking it's a merit. It's just charity. God says, no, you earned it. Abraham says, I earned it. Oops. What do I do to make sure that we're going to preserve this merit?
So, question for you. When in the beginning of this whole story, when Abraham has his Lach moment, isn't immediately after that God promises to Abraham the land and this number of descendants like the number of stars?
Yeah. So this is a reiteration of previous promises at greater length. But in the beginning, Abraham is following the word of God. Here, God is giving him a conversation. God is speaking. God is explaining. God says, I took you out of Ur Kasdim, right? Because it's all a response. You're right. So the short answer is you're right. This is an elaboration of previous promises. But now, after you heard a promise once, you're excited, you start your journey. Now we're talking about years later, and you start thinking about the promise, and the promise becomes less and less feasible. Every passing day, the promise is more miraculous, right? So now the question becomes, why am I, how I start questioning and say, how is this going to happen? Right? Some people say, Bameh, by the way, Bameh, how will I know? So far we have three interpretations. Either it's a lack of faith, or we said it's what merits. Some people say, Bameh Edah, simply, how will I know? When is this going to happen? With what will I know? What indicators will come about that I know now is the time to inherit the land? And the response for that would be, after the slavery. So that's another way of reading Bamneh. With what will I know that it's time to inherit the land? Right? So we have all kinds of possibilities. But the point is, in response to your question, is that as time passes, he's thinking about this more. It's not clear. He wants to understand. So the questions emerge. And it's not just questions of lack of faith. It's questions to gather information. Because again, according to the Malbim, his first assumption was, this is charity. God has given me charity. God says, no, you're deserving. We think that's a compliment. No, but if you're deserving, that means it's an obligation. That means you have to earn it. Oh, now he's very worried. How am I going to do? How am I going to deal? So God has to, how am I going to make sure that my children also earn it, deserve it always, and not going to lose the righteousness and the merits. Oh, so now God has, many verses to try to make that point. And so that's just the beginning. We have a lot more to say. I just have to open up the Malbim because unfortunately, when you reach my age, you can't remember everything. Go ahead, Jill.
He says, what do I do? He doesn't say, what do we do?
How do I know? Ki irashena, that I will inherit it. But the commentaries say the concept of inheritance doesn't mean me. Inheritance by definition means the concept of Yerusha. Inheritance means that it's yours and for your descendants. So in other words, how do I know that this will be my inheritance forever? The idea of inheritance would mean it continues. It's continuous. That's what inheritance means. Otherwise, it's a nice gift.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have to find my old friend here. This is great. This guy is so good. Oh man, this guy's really good. Michael, go ahead, but you're on mute.
Yes, good morning. Just a comment to see what you think. I think when we hear lack of faith, the modern interpretation is like, you don't believe that something exists. I don't think, the interpretation I've heard is that the lack of faith or the lack of belief is not the lack of belief that in existence. It's more like, when he had faith in God, he trusted God. Like, I believe in you. It doesn't mean I believe that you exist. I believe in you, like I believe in your potential. I can rely on you. Yes. Would you allow that interpretation? Like Abraham relied on God, not believe. Oh yeah, I believe that you exist. This is not that type of modern interpretation of belief that is common these days. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's okay. I like that. You're saying that belief doesn't necessarily mean the abstract concept belief in God, but Abraham is much more than that. He's believing in God that is
trustworthy. Trustworthy and reliable. You can rely and yeah.
Is present, is able to fulfill, right? Many people believe that God, even if God exists, is too abstract, doesn't really care about what's going on over here. But God is invested and is able to help and will help. Yes. So that's all included. Correct. But even that, you can read it in two ways. You could say Abraham is asking, Abraham's question of, could I not do I believe you, could I trust you? Or he's saying, what can I do to ensure that I'm deserving, and therefore you will decide to keep your promise, or you will decide to keep the gift or the inheritance that you gave me. Okay, why do I like the Malbim so much? Because he has his interpretations, but he builds off the sages. So I'm just going to read inside. He does such a good job. I don't have to. He does a great job. I'm going to read the Malbim and then we will continue. Oops. Yeah. Okay. This is the Malbim. Okay. I won't have to share the screen. You could see. You don't have to see all the stuff here. But here we go. Okay. So what do we know? Okay. Let's go back to the verses. Share the screen. Go back to the verses. Verse Right, and he said, "Oh Lord God, how will I know that I will inherit it?" And according to the Malbim, verse 8, he's saying, how do I know that my descendants will deserve it as well? And what happens? God says in verse 9, "Take from me 3 heifers and 3 goats and 3 rams and a turtle dove and a young bird." And he took for him all these, and he divided them in the middle, and he placed each part opposite its mate, but he did not divide the birds. So Abraham cuts the animals in half, does not cut the birds in half. And the birds of prey descended upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. You will see that Malbim reads this verse otherwise. He doesn't read it, Abraham drove them away. He doesn't read it that way. We'll get to what he reads in a minute. And then you have verse 12 and 13. Now the sun was ready to set, and deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, a great darkness was falling upon him. And he said to Abraham, "You shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. In other words, he's going to be told about the exodus of Egypt. Now, it's slavery in Egypt. Why do I need this? Because the Talmud said that the merit, how do you know you're going to merit it, is because of the offerings. And all of a sudden now we have the offerings and the exile. There's too many details going on over here. So let's see what the Malbim does to straighten everything out and say so everything is really the same theme. So here we go. Says the Malbim as follows. Quotes the Talmud, "How will I know that I will inherit it?" What's the answer? You know this because I already told it to you. The Talmud says, "B'schut hakarbanot," in merit of the offerings. What does it mean in the merit of the offerings? Because you're going to bring an offering, that's why you deserve the land of Israel. Like, what is offerings? Why offerings? Why not in the merit of putting on tefillin? Why specifically the offerings? So the Malbim says, brilliant. He says something brilliant. He says the offerings, it doesn't only mean the physical animal. It means the attitude and the meditation that the offerings are supposed to elicit within ourselves. Offerings represent commitment, right? The famous Nachmanides, when we'll get to the third book, we'll get to it. Nachmanides says, when you bring your offering, you're supposed to think that you are willing to offer yourself to God. And God, in his kindness, allows you to substitute it for an animal. In other words, offerings means giving over your life to God. That's what offering means. So now what do we say? We say, the reason why your children are going to merit to get the land of Israel is because of the offerings, because they have that same commitment that you had in Ur Kasdim, which in Ur Kasdim, Abraham was willing to give over his life to God. Your descendants have that as well. And that's the idea of the offerings. He says the offerings is the commitment to give over your life to Hashem. Now, this is beautiful. It's not a technical concept, the offerings, but it's really what the offerings represent. And that's why what the Talmud says, even when we don't have the offerings, we could study about the offerings in the Torah, right? Which means the concept of commitment to God, of giving over our life to God, actually, by the way, was actually more prevalent in the exile than in the times of the temple. Because in the exile, people were actually committed and sacrificed a life for God. So they didn't have the physical offering, but they had the concept of the offering. Okay, now, according to the Barbanel, according to the Malbim, we continue. What's the next verses? What is the meaning of verse? What is the meaning of verse 9 and 10? And he said to him, "Take from me 3 heifers and 3 goats." Verse 10. And he took for them all these, and he divided them in the middle. What does that mean? So the Malbim has a very, very beautiful interpretation, very creative interpretation. His interpretation is as follows. He says that how do you commit yourself? What is the idea of the offerings? And that you're giving yourself over to God. So he basically says every person has a body and a soul. And the body is represented by the various animals. Because the body is animalistic, it's biological, it wants to survive. He says the bird represents the free spiritness of the soul. So the bird is the soul, the body are the mammals, the animals. He says you have to cut the animals, don't cut the birds. In other words, what has to happen in order to have the concept of offerings, of being devoted to God, is a person has to weaken their physical and their physical animalistic parts, cut them in half, so to speak. And the bird is what rules over it. The bird is the soul. So in other words, verse 10 is telling us how we will always be able to preserve the land of Israel. which is because of the merit of the offerings. In other words, because of the commitment to God. But how do we have the commitment to God? Because we're able to understand that in the body-soul relationship, the soul is what's dominant and the body is secondary. The body is cut. The body doesn't have its own life. The body is a response to the soul. And what he reads that the verse. Now, when we go back and we read and why the three different animals? Because there's three types, three primary animalistic traits within a person. Without getting into that right now, but remember that the verse read that he didn't cut the birds, didn't divide the birds, and the birds of prey descended upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. According to his interpretation, you don't want to drive away the body and soul. It's not he drove them away. So let's see what the Malbim does. Says the Malbim like this. I have to skip a little bit. After you cut the body, you take away its life. Now the soul, the bird of prey, the ait, the soul comes back to the body, to the body to bring life. In other words, to give life into the body. In other words, that the body should live based on the values of the soul. That's how he reads it. And he says, Vayashev does not mean push it away. He says you don't find that in the Bible. Instead, Vayashev means to blow warm ear. That's how he quotes verses saying that's what Vayashev means. In other words, right now what's happening is the soul. First, you have to destroy the body. In other words, destroy the body's own life. In other words, own independent life. And then you bring the soul back in the body. The soul is what gives life to the body. Now, if that's the case, now we understand how we get the land of Israel. And we understand how we get the land of Israel. And we understand how the children are going to get it as well. Because the children also have the idea of the commitment to God, which is represented by the offerings. Give me a minute, Jill. I want to finish the point, then we'll take questions. Okay, so it's all wonderful. So why do I now need the next part? Why do I now need the whole idea of the Exodus from Egypt? So here he continues, and it's all connected. Says the Malbim as follows. Says the Malbim as follows. How are we going to get to this? How is this going to happen? How is the body weakened and the soul becomes primary? Says the Malbim, how does that happen? It happens through the exile. And this is very interesting. He says a person's life, I'll read it from him because he's very poetic. Says the Malbim as follows. He says, just like with an individual person, if in his youth he has some pain and some challenges, and that pain and challenge weakens the body and allows the person to connect to the soul. Says the Malbim, the same thing is if you look at the Jewish people collectively as a nation as a whole. In its youth, it suffered the pain. It suffered the pain of exile. That weakens the physical body and it allows for the soul to be dominant within the person. And now you see, according to the Malbim, what's beautiful about this interpretation is now all parts of this discussion are all tied in. Abraham wants to know, how do I merit the land of Israel? God responds, offerings. What does offering mean? Offering means commitment to God. Just like you had the commitment to God in Ur Kasdim, your descendants will also be committed to God, will also be devoted to God completely, willing to risk their life for God, as we have seen in the times of the temple, but even more in the times of the exile. Okay, so that's the response. The response is we're always going to preserve that feeling of Abraham, that Abraham had to God in Ur Kasdim. His children will also have it. How do we ensure that his children will have it? For that, you need the exile, because the exile, by weakening the body, is cutting the animal in half, cutting the physical body in half, allowing for the soul to be dominant and the soul to once again bring life into the body. In other words, our physical life is also infused and directed by the soul. And that happens collectively to the Jewish people through the exile in Egypt. Now, what he's doing is he's giving an interpretation for the exile of Egypt, which some people do. And some people say that this is the reason. The reason is that you have to weaken the body. You have to break the ego to allow for the sense of spirituality. And that's the path that the Malbim takes. As we will see next week, other people disagree. Other people say that's not the reason for the exile. I don't even know if there is a reason for the exile. We have all kinds of interpretations. But for today, we want to go with the Malbim. And we want to say, so tie everything up and say, what's going on here? What did we learn today? What we learned today is that Abraham comes to God and God gives Abraham a promise. Abraham responds to God and Abraham says, wonderful, you're so kind. You're so charitable. You're giving me these wonderful promises. God responds and says, I'm not charitable. It's not charity. You're not a charity case. You're getting this because I took you out of Ur Kasdim, which is code for you were devoted to God, willing to give up your life for God. That's why you deserve this. Abraham says, Oivei, if this is a question of whether we deserve, maybe my descendants will not deserve. God says, don't worry, your descendants will deserve. Why? Well, we're going to have animals. We're going to cut animals in half. What does that mean? It means their descendants are going to have offerings, literal and figurative offerings, which means just like you were devoted to God, they're going to be devoted to God. How are they going to be devoted to God? Why would someone give over their life to God? Because in their life, the soul is dominant over the body. The body is just a vehicle for the soul. The body is secondary, not primary. So the body is cut. The body doesn't have its own life. The life that it has is because the bird's blowing on the body. That's the symbolism. How does this happen? How is this going to happen that our bodies are weakened to the point that our primary essence is the soul? Well, collectively, spiritually, we don't have to go through our own exile because it happens spiritually to the collective Jewish people. As nationally, the whole nation is one experience and one being. So, Barbara Malbim says that's what the exile is. The exile is the cutting the animals in half, which is breaking the body. But the soul, that remains intact. And you'll see the other interpretations next week. What is the soul? The soul is the bird. What's the bird? The bird is the spirit of freedom, right? The symbol of the bird, it can fly, right? So even though the body was broken, even on a practical level, the body in Egypt was broken, but the spirit of freedom, that was never broken. And that God tells Abraham, the exile won't affect that, right? To the contrary, maybe in exile, we're forced to recognize that even when we lose everything else, we still can preserve the will to be free, and that's our soul, and that's what keeps us going, and that is primary. So that's the story in short, according to this interpretation. We'll take Jill's question. Like I said, there's so much to say because there's so many other interpretations. God willing, next week we'll offer more interpretations, especially about the angle of what's the purpose of the exile. But I like the Malbim for a few reasons. The reason why I like the Malbim is because he gives a creative interpretation, but he incorporates the Talmud. He's incorporating an interpretation that's 2,000 years old. He's giving his own interpretation about this discussion between God and the Jewish people, God and Abraham, of whether or not the promise is because we're deserving or because we earned it. And he's tying in the whole conversation with the Talmud about the offerings. And he also connects both parts of the covenant between both parts of the symbolism, the cutting of the animal and the birds being intact, together with and he says that's the weakening of the body and them showing the dominance of the soul over the body. And that's something that the Jewish people will have. And how will we have it? Because of the exile. So I think this is a very creative interpretation. So I figured I put it here. If you don't like it, come back next week. I'm sure there'll be other interpretations as well. Go ahead, Jill.
This is just a teeny thing, but the metaphor of the birds. Now, the birds the birds of prey as an attacker of the body don't seem to be the same bird.
Correct. So what happens is you're right, because the English translation, the one I have here, let's see what the Art Scroll translates it. But you're right that if you highlight in the translation "ait" as a bird of prey, you're right that it doesn't seem to fit. But I'm just curious what Art Scroll does and what Rashi does. So hang on to that thought. Give me a second. You raise a good point.
Same, Art Scroll does the same.
And birds of prey. Okay, I doubt Rashi will do the same thing. Let's see what Rashi says. It happens to be a bird of prey, but Ait is a specific bird. Ait is some type of eagle. So we're not interpreting it as negative. You'll look at Rashi, we'll get to it next week, we'll see that Rashi does not interpret the bird as something negative. So the Malbim continues in the path of the Medrash that the bird is positive. The bird is not negative. It happens to be that the ayit is a bird of prey, but you don't have to translate it as bird of prey, drawing attention to the bird of prey, right? It's just a bird. If you look at verse 11, in the Targum, Onkelos translates unachat ofa, and the bird goes onto the carcasses. The bird, it happens to be, I know Jill is a bird watcher, so Jill is very interested to know what type of bird is it? Was it bird of prey? Was it not? But Targum Onkelos, he didn't care. He said bird, right? So again, when you translate it as bird of prey, and it's true, ayit is a bird of prey. It's a non-kosher animal. But the question is, are we highlighting that aspect of it, or are we highlighting it, this free-spiritedness of it, and the fact that it is never, it's hard to tame it? That's the aspect, the positive aspect that is the interpretation of Abraham's image, Abraham's vision. So that's the best I can do, Jill. I can't think of it to be a bird of prey. But the question is, what aspect of the bird are you zeroing in on? And like I said, both the Art Scroll and the Mitzuda do that. But I wouldn't do that. And Onkelos doesn't do that. Onkelos said ofa. Ofa is a bird. Of in Hebrew. In Aramaic, you just add an aleph and you get ofa, and that's easy. Go ahead, Bob.
If I think Genesis teaches us anything, there's a certain unpredictability to mankind, and because of free choice, and because of the flood, and because Abraham remembers all this, there's a certain sense of, merit and conditional love. So I think when Abraham comes to God and says, show me a sign, he's already been told just in the phrase before that you merit it from Or Chazdim, your gift. He's coming up rightly say, hey, people are unpredictable. We certainly don't have an unconditional bond before. We had the flood. People have disappointed you. How can you be so sure that my descendants will be meritorious of such a gift?
That's a wonderful question. That's Abraham's question. So you phrase that perfectly. The question is, what's the response, right? What's the response? And I want to add something, because you're right that we have, the relationship in the final analysis is our relationship with God. Is it conditional or is it unconditional? That's a very interesting question. We need more than 60 seconds for this. But the answer is it's both. In other words, if you look at the promises in Deuteronomy, God says, and Maimonides codifies this, he says, eventually we will return to the land of Israel. There's no question. In other words, if you want to talk historically, it's unconditional. No matter what, the Talmud says Mashiach will either come when everybody is deserving or when everyone's undeserving, right? So in other words, even if everybody's undeserving, Mashiach is going to come. That's not a question. In other words, we are the promised nation. We're going to come back to the land of Israel. So historically, that aspect is unconditional. But what is conditional is which generation will it happen to? There's no guarantee that in our generation, we will merit to see the redemption, right? People lived for 2,000 years. They couldn't go to Israel. They couldn't go to the Kotel, and Mashiach didn't come. And there's no guarantee that it's going to happen to you. So there is this balance that collectively speaking with the chosen people, we're going to go back to the land of Israel and the sin won't get in the way. That's the promise. That's the unconditional aspect. The conditional aspect is, who is it? In which generation is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? It's a beautiful interpretation on Parshas Ekev, where in Deuteronomy, where the verse says, because you will listen to the commandments, God will keep the covenants. And the commentaries say, 1 second, if you keep the commandments, then you're deserving of the land of Israel. You don't need the covenant, right? So the covenant represents unconditional. Keeping the commandments means it's conditional. So that interpretation is what's unconditional is that we're going to go back to the land of Israel, no question. The question is, will it happen in your generation? So that could be conditional. So the answer, so in short, what I'm saying is that there is an element of both, and therefore you're right. Abraham asks the question and says, what are we doing? Why are we going to be deserving? And God is saying that there's always the Jewish people may sin, may serve idols, they may get into trouble, but they're always going to have that aspect of the offerings. They're always going to be there's always going to be a commitment to God that people are willing to give themselves to God and sacrifice their life for God. And history has proven that. We know that. And we know that the people who gave their life for God were not always necessarily the most learned people, but that's the Jewish soul. The Jewish soul always wants to be connected to God. Now, What the Malbim is adding is how do we get this? How do we get this? How is this in our spiritual DNA? Right? For some Jews, it surfaces. Sometimes it doesn't surface. It only surfaces at certain times. Okay, but it's in our DNA. We are the offerings. We are people who are willing to give ourselves to God. We're dedicated to God. And that's what the Talmud says. It's in the merit of the offerings. But what the Malbim is adding is, how do we have this? How do we get this? So what the Malbim says, it's in our spiritual DNA also because of the Exodus. Because of the slavery. Slavery has an element of breaking the physical body and inserting the idea of freedom, the idea of the primacy of the soul. And that is the spiritual effect that happens to us through the slavery and the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. And now it's embedded in our DNA. Now, when is it going to surface? When are we going to see that we're like the offerings that were committed to God? When exactly is the promise going to come and we're going to go back to Israel? That we don't know. That depends on other factors. But the fact that collectively we're always going to have this within ourselves, and therefore we always merit, ultimately we're always going to merit, that comes from who we are. That's never going to change. And by the way, even though collectively the Jewish people, even though simply the verse is talking about the slavery and the exodus of Egypt, as you will see, the Medrash talks about up to verse 17 is the exodus from Egypt. From 17 and on, verse 17, the Medrash says that's future exiles. So within here is also future exiles. I'll give it away right now. The verse says, after this whole promise of you're going to come back to Israel, after this whole thing, you get verse 17. So it happened, the sun set and it was very dark. Behold, there was a smoky furnace and a torch of fire which passed between these pieces. The Medrash is going to say, what's the great darkness that befalls after the Exodus? Oh, after the Exodus of Egypt, don't forget these other darknesses. There are other exiles. And even that we're going to come back from. And then in verse 18, we have the promise that we're going to get not just the land of Israel that we got with Joshua, but we're going to get the 10 nations from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. That didn't happen yet. That's going to happen when Mashiach comes. So in this story, it's not just the exodus of Egypt, it's also the exodus of the future exiles. And the bottom line is, what we take away from this, at least according to the Malbim, is that the connection between the Jewish people and God and the land of Israel is a covenant. You could read it in a few ways. It's a covenant, meaning it's unconditional. But according to the Malbim, it's saying it is conditional. But it's because we earned it. Why do we earn it? Because we have the commitment to God like the offerings. Why do we have the commitment to God like offerings? Because it's built into our DNA going back all the way to Egypt. That's the thesis of the Malbim. That's how he connects all the different pieces of the puzzle. Like I said, not everyone disagrees. There are many other interpretations of reading this, reading the details and reading the reason for the exile. So we'll get to that in the future weeks, or at least next week. But this is how you read the entire chapter 15 as one continuous conversation, which I think is beautiful.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful day, everybody. And we should meet each other in good health, God willing.